January 1943. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly across the Ukrainian steppe, broken only by the skeletal remains of shattered villages and the black scars of shell craters. A Soviet captain knelt beside an overturned American truck, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. His gloved hands trembled, not from the cold, but from what he had just discovered. Inside a wooden crate, marked with English lettering, were dozens of small cardboard boxes, K-rations, American field rations. He opened one with his knife, the blade slicing through the waxed paper with a sound that seemed too loud in the winter silence. Inside, wrapped in protective layers, were items he had never seen together in one place. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned meat, cheese, powdered coffee, chewing gum, sugar tablets, even matches coated in wax to keep them dry. His eyes widened as he examined each item, turning them over in his hands like artifacts from another world. The chocolate felt heavy and rich. The cigarette packet displayed bright colors and clean typography. The can of meat showed no rust, no dents, sealed so perfectly it might have come from a Moscow department store in peacetime. But Moscow stores had never looked like this, not even before the war. He sat back on his heels, the K-rations spread before him like evidence in a trial. His mind raced through every propaganda poster he had seen, every speech he had memorized, every lesson drilled into him since joining the Communist Party in 1935. The West was failing. Capitalism was dying. American workers starved while Soviet citizens built the future. He had believed it all until this moment, until he held the proof of American abundance in his frost-bitten hands. Before you continue with this story, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, drop a comment below telling me what you think happened to this Soviet captain, and subscribe to this channel because we are bringing you the real stories from World War II that nobody else will tell you. The stories they tried to hide, the truths that change everything you thought you knew. Now let's get back to that frozen field in Ukraine and discover what really happened when Soviet soldiers encountered American abundance for the first time. The Soviet Union entered World War II carrying the weight of 2 decades of carefully constructed lies. Since the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet propaganda had painted a specific picture of the capitalist West. In newspapers, in radio broadcasts, in school textbooks, and on massive posters that covered building walls, the message remained consistent. America was a land of suffering. British workers lived in squalor. Western democracy was a facade covering the exploitation of the masses. Soviet propaganda in the 1920s through 1940s depicted capitalism as fundamentally immoral, responsible for the ills of the world. Plutocracies ruled the West, and these governments intended to destroy the Soviet Union, portrayed as a workers' paradise. The Soviet people were told they lived in the most advanced society on Earth. While the West collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression, the Soviet Union was building socialism. While American children begged in the streets, Soviet children attended free schools. While British families faced unemployment and hunger, Soviet workers enjoyed guaranteed jobs and state-provided food. This was not merely propaganda. This was the foundation of Soviet identity. To be Soviet meant to believe in Soviet superiority. To question this meant to question everything. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, questioning anything could mean death. But then came June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa exploded across the Soviet border with a violence that stunned the world. 3 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed through Soviet defenses. Within months, the Wehrmacht had captured vast territories, millions of prisoners, and destroyed huge portions of the Red Army. The Soviet Union teetered on the edge of collapse. Stalin needed help. He needed it desperately, and it had to come from the capitalist West he had spent 2 decades condemning. The irony was not lost on Soviet leadership, but survival demanded pragmatism. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Lend-Lease Act was extended to the Soviet Union. Initially, the Soviets could receive up to $1 billion worth of goods without paying interest, and repayment would not begin until 5 years after the war ended. The American arsenal of democracy opened its doors to Soviet Russia. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, through dangerous convoy routes that braved U-boat attacks and winter storms, American ships began delivering supplies to Soviet ports. Trucks, tanks, aircraft, locomotives, industrial machinery, raw materials, petroleum, and food. Millions of tons of food. For Soviet soldiers who had grown up on propaganda, these deliveries created a problem that went far deeper than military logistics. They created a crisis of belief. When our Soviet captain first encountered American Lend-Lease supplies in 1942, he expected them to be inferior. Soviet propaganda had prepared him for this. American capitalism produced shoddy goods. American factories exploited workers who had no pride in their labor. American military equipment would break down, rust quickly, perform poorly. This was the message Soviet citizens absorbed from childhood through posters and state media, depicting the West as plutocracies where death and poverty of the masses generated income for the rich. But when the first Studebaker trucks arrived, they did not break down. Over the course of the war, the Americans delivered over 400,000 trucks and other vehicles. During the same period, Soviet factories produced less than 200,000 trucks. These American trucks drove through mud that would stop Soviet vehicles. They operated in cold that would freeze Soviet engines. They carried loads that would break Soviet axles. Soviet soldiers were so impressed with their quality and performance that the term Studebaker became synonymous with excellence. When American tanks arrived, they came with features Soviet tankers had never seen: radios that actually worked, interiors that accommodated the crew comfortably, armor that was properly welded, vision ports that gave better visibility. Our captain watched as his subordinates preferred to drive American Shermans rather than Soviet T-34s, despite being told their entire lives that Soviet engineering was superior. When American aircraft arrived, bearing red stars painted over American markings, Soviet pilots discovered cockpits with better instrumentation, engines with better reliability, and performance characteristics that matched or exceeded what Soviet factories produced. But nothing challenged Soviet propaganda more profoundly than American food. The Soviet Union in 1943 was starving. This was not an exaggeration. This was documented fact. Even before the war, Stalin's domestic policies resulted in food shortages across the USSR, with an estimated 5 million people dying from starvation. Soviet food stocks were insufficient even before the Nazi invasion. The German occupation made everything worse. The Wehrmacht occupied the most productive Soviet farmlands in Ukraine and the northern Caucasus. These occupied areas previously produced 38% of the grain, 84% of sugar supplies, 60% of sunflower oil, 38% of the cattle, and 60% of the hogs. Soviet grain production fell from 95 million tons in 1940 to just 29 million tons in 1942. Potato production dropped from 75 million tons to 23 million tons. Meat production declined from 4.7 million tons to 1.8 million tons. Wartime rationing started in July 1941, and by 1943, food was so scarce that in some areas civilians reportedly ate grass, roots, and leaves. Official government figures admitted that food consumption dropped 35 to 40% during the conflict. Red Army soldiers received minimal rations: a piece of bread, some kasha if they were lucky, perhaps some cabbage soup. Meat was a luxury remembered from better times. Then, the Americans began shipping food. From 1942 through 1945, American food supplies to the Soviet Union totaled 4.5 million tons. A full quarter of all Lend-Lease tonnage sent to the Soviet Union was food. In the first few months of 1943, American produce alone accounted for 17% of Red Army calories, along with half the fats consumed by uniformed personnel. The amounts were staggering. Canned meat, powdered eggs, flour, sugar, butter, lard, cheese, powdered coffee, chewing gum, sugar tablets,
Even the chocolate was even more problematic. Soviet citizens rarely saw chocolate except in propaganda posters showing happy children in Moscow. The captain broke off a square of the Hershey bar included in the K-ration. The chocolate snapped cleanly with a satisfying sound. He placed it on his tongue and let it melt. Rich, sweet, smooth. It melted evenly without the grainy texture of the ersatz chocolate sometimes available in Soviet cities before the war. This was real chocolate, mass-produced, included in every single ration for every single American soldier. Millions of these rations existed. Millions of chocolate bars, millions of cigarette packets, millions of pieces of chewing gum. The sheer abundance was incomprehensible. But the canned meat revealed the deepest contradiction. The Soviet Union received massive shipments of American canned pork and ham products, including the famous Spam. By 1944, even Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev acknowledged this contribution, later quipping that without Spam, we should not have been able to feed our army. The captain had eaten Soviet canned meat before the war. When available, it came in crude cans that often rusted, with contents that were fatty and of questionable origin. The American cans showed no rust. The labels were colorful and clean. The English words were printed with perfect alignment. He used his bayonet to open one of the Spam cans. The key turned smoothly, the metal peeling back in a perfect spiral. Inside, the pink meat was packed tightly, with a layer of gelatin on top. He cut a slice. The meat was firm, holding its shape. He tasted it. Salty, fatty, rich with protein. It was not delicate cuisine, but it was real meat preserved perfectly, capable of lasting months or years without refrigeration. Around him, other Soviet soldiers were making the same discoveries. They opened crates of American supplies and found a material abundance that contradicted everything they'd been taught. One soldier discovered American boots. The United States shipped 15 million pairs of military boots to the Soviet Union during the war. These were not crude Valinki or basic leather boots. These were well-constructed footwear with rubber soles, proper insulation, and sizes that actually fit. Soviet soldiers began preferring American boots over their own. Another soldier found American wool blankets. Thick, well-woven, warm. The United States said millions of these as well. Soviet soldiers wrapped themselves in American wool and felt warmth they had not known in months. A young lieutenant discovered American medical supplies, bandages that were clean and sterile, medicines that were clearly labeled, surgical instruments that were precision-made. The contrast with Soviet medical supplies was stark. Our captain sat in the snow, surrounded by evidence that demolished decades of propaganda. He had been a loyal Communist Party member since 1935. He had participated in rallies denouncing Western imperialism. He had read all the correct books and repeated all the correct slogans. He believed in Soviet superiority with the fervor of the converted, but now he held American chocolate in one hand and American cigarettes in the other. And the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. If the West was collapsing, why were their rations better than anything Soviet soldiers had ever seen? If American workers were exploited and starving, how did they produce such abundance? If capitalism was dying, why did American trucks outperform Soviet trucks? American food surpass Soviet food. American manufactured goods exceed Soviet manufactured goods in quality and quantity. These questions were dangerous. In Stalin's Soviet Union, even thinking them could be fatal. The NKVD monitored for exactly this kind of ideological contamination. Soldiers who praised American equipment too loudly sometimes disappeared. Officers who questioned the party line found themselves facing tribunals, but the questions persisted because the evidence was everywhere. The transformation happened slowly. Conversation by conversation, discovery by discovery. Soviet soldiers began understanding that they had been lied to, not about small things, about everything. The scope of the lie was so vast, it was difficult to comprehend. Soviet propaganda during the 1920s through 1940s had claimed that capitalism was fundamentally immoral and that Western plutocracies intended to destroy the workers' paradise of the Soviet Union. But if the West intended to destroy the Soviet Union, why were they sending millions of tons of supplies to keep the Red Army fighting? From 1941 through 1945, American lend-lease to the Soviet Union totaled over $11 billion, roughly equivalent to $250 billion today. Those shipments included 400,000 vehicles, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, 8,000 tractors, 4.5 million tons of food, and 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, as well as millions of blankets, uniforms, and boots, and 107,000 tons of cotton. These were not the actions of a dying system. These were the actions of the most productive industrial economy on Earth, an economy so powerful it could fight a global war on multiple fronts while simultaneously supplying its allies with more equipment than those allies could produce themselves. Even Soviet leadership knew the truth. At the Tehran Conference in December 1943, Stalin raised a toast and said, "The most important things in this war are machines. The United States is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost this war." Stalin said this to Allied leaders, but he never said it to Soviet citizens. Later, Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, recalled in his memoirs, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. We shouldn't boast that we vanquished the Germans all by ourselves." Khrushchev credited the trucks and equipment received after Stalingrad with enabling the Soviet mechanized offensives of 1944 and 1945, observing that without them, our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. But during the war and for decades afterward, official Soviet histories downplayed or simply omitted American contributions. Soviet historians claim that Lend-Lease amounted to only 4% of Red Army material production, a figure that excluded crucial years of 1944 and 1945 deliveries and ignored the stopgap support that came at critical moments when the USSR was at a tipping point. The lie continued because the truth was too dangerous to the Soviet system. Our captain understood this instinctively. He could not speak openly about what he had discovered. To do so would invite suspicion, investigation, possibly arrest. So he remained silent in public while his worldview crumbled in private. He continued eating American rations while telling his subordinates about Soviet superiority. He continued driving American trucks while praising Soviet engineering. He continued using American equipment while reciting party slogans. But inside, something had changed. The chocolate became his symbol. Every time he opened a K-ration and found that Hershey bar inside, he was reminded of the lie. Such a small thing, a few squares of chocolate wrapped in brown paper and foil. But it represented something vast. It represented an industrial capacity that could produce millions of chocolate bars as an afterthought, while supplying entire armies with food, weapons, and equipment. It represented an economic system that generated such abundance that chocolate and cigarettes and chewing gum were simply expected components of a soldier's daily ration. It represented everything Soviet propaganda had told him was impossible under capitalism. He began noticing other details. American aluminum alone accounted for 42% of Soviet supplies of the metal. Aviation fuel from America equaled over 50% of what the USSR produced during the war. The United States even shipped to the Soviet Union a Ford tire factory so they could produce tires for military vehicles. This was not just sending finished goods, this was transferring industrial capacity itself. Americans built factories and sent them across the ocean to help the Soviet Union manufacture its own supplies. What kind of dying economic system does that? What kind of exploited workers produce such abundance that they can export entire factories to their allies? The captain had no answers, only questions. Questions that grew more troubling the longer he considered them. If Soviet propaganda lied about American abundance, what else had they lied about? If the West was not collapsing, was the Soviet Union actually the most advanced society on Earth? If American workers produced such quality and quantity, were they really exploited? If capitalism could generate this level of wealth, was socialism truly the inevitable future of humanity? These questions attacked the foundations of everything he believed, everything he had built his identity upon, everything that gave his sacrifices meaning. The Red Army continued its advance westward, through 1943, through 1944, through into 1945. Riding in American trucks, eating American food, wearing American boots, the Red Army drove towards Berlin. Soviet soldiers encountered more Lend-Lease supplies with each passing month. By 1944, the deliveries reached their peak. The majority of Lend-Lease equipment arrived in 1944 and 1945, not in the earlier years that Soviet statistics often emphasized. More trucks, more tanks, more aircraft, more locomotives, more food. The material abundance was everywhere. Soviet soldiers could not escape it. They lived with it daily, and they depended on it for survival. And they could not talk about it. American rations became simultaneously the most appreciated and the most secret aspect of Soviet military life. Soldiers ate the contents while hiding the packaging. They smoked American cigarettes, but claimed they were so.
When Soviet forces finally entered Berlin in April 1945, they did so as conquerors. But they conquered riding American trucks, eating American food, wearing American boots, and using American fuel. The Red Ball Express system that had supplied Western Allied forces demonstrated the vast American logistical capability, with African-American drivers delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily through a highly organized convoy system. That same capability had kept the Red Army supplied across thousands of miles of Eastern European territory. Our captain stood in the ruins of the Reichstag in May 1945. Around him, Soviet soldiers celebrated victory. They had defeated Nazi Germany. They had avenged the death and destruction visited upon the Soviet Union. They had won the Great Patriotic War. But the captain knew a secret that could never be fully acknowledged. They had won with American help. Enormous, unprecedented, absolutely critical American help. Without it, the Soviet Union would likely have collapsed. Stalin himself admitted this privately to Allied leaders, though it would take decades before such admissions became public knowledge. Victory created a new problem. With the war over, Soviet propaganda needed to rewrite history. The American contribution had to be minimized, downplayed, eventually almost erased from official accounts. Soviet historians after the war claimed that only 12% of airplanes, 10% of tanks, and 2% of artillery pieces from Lend-Lease were used in the fight, and that total Lend-Lease amounted to only 4% of Red Army material production. These statistics were misleading at best and deliberately false at worst. They excluded crucial delivery periods. They ignored raw materials and industrial equipment. They dismissed the stopgap support that came at critical moments. They erased the food that prevented famine. They omitted the transportation equipment that enabled Soviet offensives. The lie was necessary because the truth undermined everything the Soviet system claimed about itself. If capitalism could produce such abundance, if Western workers could generate such quality, if American industry could supply entire Allied armies while fighting its own war, then what did that say about Soviet socialism? What did it say about the inevitable triumph of communism? What did it say about everything Soviet citizens had sacrificed for? The answer was too dangerous to contemplate publicly. So the lie continued through the late 1940s, through the Cold War, through decades of Soviet history. American contributions to Soviet victory became a footnote, then a whisper, then barely mentioned at all. Soviet children learned that the USSR defeated Nazi Germany alone through the superiority of socialism and the genius of Stalin. They learned that the West was failing, that capitalism was dying, that only communism represented the future. They learned exactly what their parents and grandparents had been taught. The same lies, the same propaganda, the same carefully constructed worldview that our captain had held until that day in January 1943 when he opened an American K-ration and discovered chocolate. But the soldiers who fought the war knew better. They had seen the truth. They had eaten American food, driven American trucks, worn American boots. They had lived with the evidence of American abundance daily for years. They could not forget. Veterans gathered after the war and spoke in careful whispers about the Lend-Lease supplies. They shared memories of the first time they tasted Spam or drove a Studebaker or opened a K-ration. These memories were dangerous, but persistent. Truth has a way of surviving even when officially suppressed. Our captain survived the war. He returned to a Soviet Union that was devastated but victorious. He received medals and commendations. He was honored as a hero of the Great Patriotic War. He never spoke publicly about what he had learned. To do so would have destroyed his career, endangered his family, possibly cost him his life. He lived with the secret for decades, but he never forgot the chocolate, that small square of Hershey bar melting on his tongue while snow fell on a Ukrainian battlefield, that moment when his entire worldview shifted, that instant when he realized Stalin had been lying. The chocolate represented more than just a sweet treat. It represented the fundamental difference between Soviet propaganda and Western reality. It represented the gap between what he had been told and what actually existed. It represented the abundance of a system he had been taught to despise, producing luxuries that his own supposedly superior system could barely manage necessities. In his old age, after Stalin's death, after Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, after some of the worst repressions had eased, the captain finally told his grandchildren about the K-ration. He described opening that box in the snow. He described each item inside. He described the feeling of realization that washed over him. He described understanding that everything was a lie. His grandchildren listened with wide eyes. They were growing up in a slightly different Soviet Union, one where some truths could be whispered, where some acknowledgments could be made. But even then, decades after the war, even after Stalin's death, speaking too openly about American contributions remained dangerous. The system still required the lie to survive. The story of Soviet encounters with American abundance during World War II is not just about military logistics. It is not just about lend-lease statistics and shipment tonnages. It is about the power of evidence to demolish propaganda. It is about what happens when people who have been systematically lied to encounter undeniable proof of the truth. The Red Army inflicted about 70% of battle deaths the Wehrmacht suffered, losing some 25 million people in the 4-year struggle. Soviet sacrifice and Soviet blood defeated Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. This is historical fact and must be acknowledged. But Soviet victory was enabled by American supplies on a scale that Stalin himself admitted was decisive for survival. This is also historical fact and equally must be acknowledged. Both truths can coexist. Both truths must coexist for honest history. The chocolate bar in the K-ration represents the small details that reveal large truths. It represents how propaganda fails when confronted with lived experience. It represents the moment when a Soviet captain looked at American abundance and realized his entire worldview was built on lies. That moment occurred thousands of times across the Eastern Front as Soviet soldiers encountered Lend-Lease supplies. Thousands of individual realizations, thousands of private crises of faith, thousands of secrets that could never be spoken aloud. These moments mattered. They changed how soldiers understood their world. They planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into broader questions about the Soviet system itself. They proved that truth persists even under totalitarian suppression. Today, decades after the Soviet Union's collapse, we can finally speak openly about these matters. We can acknowledge both Soviet sacrifice and American contribution without diminishing either. We can recognize that defeating Nazi Germany required an unprecedented alliance between systems that profoundly distrusted each other. We can understand that the arsenal of democracy was not just a propaganda slogan, but a real industrial capacity that helped save the Soviet Union from destruction. We can honor the memory of Soviet soldiers who fought with incredible courage while also acknowledging they did so with American equipment. We can admit that our Soviet captain was right to question what he had been taught, and that his realization was both profound and dangerous. The chocolate matters because small things often reveal large truths. A few squares of Hershey bar included as an afterthought in millions of K-rations represented an economic system producing such abundance that luxuries became routine. That level of production was incompatible with Soviet propaganda about Western collapse. The contradiction could not be resolved within the Soviet ideological framework, so it was suppressed, hidden, minimized, and eventually almost forgotten. But the soldiers who fought the war knew better. They had seen the truth. They had eaten American food, driven American trucks, worn American boots. They had lived with the evidence of American abundance daily for years. They could not forget. Veterans gathered after the war and spoke in careful whispers about the Lend-Lease supplies. They shared memories of the first time they tasted Spam or drove a Studebaker or opened a K-ration. These memories were dangerous but persistent. Truth as a way of surviving even when officially suppressed. War reveals truths that peace can sometimes hide. In the crucible of combat, propaganda meets reality, and reality always wins. Soviet soldiers discovered this through direct experience. They learned that American capitalism, supposedly dying and exploitation-based, produced more abundance than Soviet socialism could imagine. They learned that American workers, supposedly impoverished and oppressed, manufactured goods of higher quality than Soviet workers, with all their supposed revolutionary consciousness. They learned that the West, supposedly collapsing, was actually thriving on a scale that made Soviet achievements look modest by comparison. These lessons were dangerous under Stalin. They remained dangerous under his successors. They contributed to the long, slow erosion of faith in the Soviet system that would eventually lead to its collapse decades later. But in 1943, on a frozen Ukrainian battlefield, all our captain knew is that his world had changed. He could not speak about it, he could not act on it, but he could not unknow it either. The chocolate had shown him the truth, and once seen, truth cannot be unseen. That is its power.
That is why totalitarian systems fear it so much. That is why they construct elaborate propaganda machines to suppress it. And that is why it ultimately survives, despite everything. If you found this story as revealing as that Soviet captain found his K-ration, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we upload these hidden stories from World War II. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how propaganda collapses when confronted with reality. And leave a comment telling me what other untold stories from the war you want us to cover. History is not just what happened, it is what we remember and what we choose to pass on. This is a story worth remembering. A Soviet captain, an American K-ration, and the moment when chocolate revealed that everything was a lie. That moment mattered then, it matters now, and it will matter as long as we remember that truth is more powerful